Monica Carter glanced at the clock on her dashboard as she parked her sedan in front of the Riverwood Courthouse. 9 minutes until the trial began. Her pulse quickened. Today was the day she had been both dreading and preparing for meticulously. This wasn't just another trial. It was the kind that could redefine how racial profiling cases were handled in the state of Mapleford. Stepping out of her car, Monica paused, taking a deep breath to steady herself. As one of the few black judges in the state, Monica had long since mastered the art of composure under pressure. But this case was different. It was deeply personal. The defendant, a young black man named Isaiah Bennett, had been arrested in his own neighborhood without cause. The officer who detained him claimed Isaiah matched the description of someone suspicious. Monica's jaw clenched as she crossed the parking lot, her heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement. The weight of the case hung heavy on her, but she refused to let it show. Instead of using the grand entrance where reporters swarmed like bees, cameras flashing and questions flying, Monica chose the quieter side door. She didn't have time to navigate the media frenzy. As she neared the entrance, Monica noticed a young white officer standing stiffly by the door, his hand resting near his belt. His eyes followed her as she approached. Monica instinctively reached for the ID badge hanging from her neck, her usual routine before entering the courthouse. But before she could present it, the officer stepped into her path. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," he demanded sharply. Monica raised an eyebrow, surprised by the intensity of his tone. She held up her badge, her voice calm but firm. "I'm Judge Carter. I'm presiding over the Bennett trial this morning." The officer didn't even glance at her badge. Instead, his cold eyes scanned her up and down, as if assessing her worthiness. Monica felt a familiar burn of frustration and anger rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. "There's been an incident nearby, and you match the description of someone involved," he said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "I'm going to need you to answer a few questions." For a moment, Monica stood frozen, her mind racing to comprehend the situation. The irony was almost unbearable. She was on her way to oversee a landmark trial on racial profiling, and here she was, being racially profiled at the courthouse door. "Officer," she said, her tone measured though her pulse quickened, "I don't have time for this. The trial starts in less than 10 minutes, and I need to be inside." She held her badge up again, hoping he would realize his mistake. But the officer didn't budge. His hand hovered near the handcuffs on his belt as he stepped closer. "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am," he snapped. "You're going to need to come with me." Monica's breath caught. The situation was escalating quickly, and she could see the look in his eyes, a combination of suspicion and contempt she knew all too well. This wasn't about her being a judge. It was about her being black. Before Monica could respond, another voice broke through the tension. "What's going on here?" Both Monica and the young officer turned to see an older black officer striding toward them. His face was a mixture of concern and surprise. "Carter?" His eyes widened as he recognized her. "Judge Carter?" "Yes," Monica replied tightly, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. The older officer shot a sharp glance at his younger colleague. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice firm. The younger officer hesitated, his jaw tightening as he reluctantly stepped back. "She matches the description," he muttered, almost to himself. "That's the judge," the older officer snapped. "Do you want to lose your job?" The younger officer's face flushed, and he mumbled something under his breath before retreating completely. Monica let out a slow breath, willing her racing heart to calm. She nodded curtly to the older officer in acknowledgement, before stepping past the two men and into the courthouse. Though she didn't say it aloud, her gratitude for the older officer's intervention was undeniable. But as she walked down the sterile hallway toward her courtroom, Monica couldn't shake the encounter from her mind. This was supposed to be a day about justice. Instead, it had begun with a painful reminder of why this case mattered so much. She squared her shoulders, determined not to let the morning's events distract her. There was a trial to preside over, and Isaiah Bennett was counting on her to deliver fairness in a system that so often denied it. Monica Carter forced herself to take a slow, steady breath. Losing her composure now would only validate the assumptions of people like the young officer who had just confronted her. She straightened her shoulders as the older black officer who intervened asked gently, "Are you all right, ma'am?" Monica gave a clipped nod, her jaw tight. "I'm fine, thank you." Without waiting for a response, she turned and stepped into the Riverwood Courthouse. The sterile, familiar halls greeted her, offering a semblance of routine, but her heart continued to race. The encounter outside replayed in her mind like a broken record. Monica had faced racism her entire life, but for it to happen today, on the morning of this trial, felt like a cruel twist of fate. She couldn't dwell on it now, though. She had a job to do. Monica entered the courtroom and settled at the bench, lifting the gavel. With a sharp bang, the room quieted. "Court is now in session," she announced. Opening statements began smoothly, each side presenting their arguments. Yet Monica's mind kept drifting back to the officer's face, the sneering expression, the quick judgment. It was impossible to ignore how closely the incident mirrored the case before her. When the first witness, Isaiah Bennett, was called to the stand, Monica leaned forward slightly, her focus sharpening. The young man was composed but visibly weary as he began to recount his experience. "I was walking to meet my rideshare," Isaiah explained, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Then an officer stopped me. He said I looked suspicious, but I wasn't doing anything wrong." Isaiah's testimony was raw and painful. He described how the officer had humiliated him, handcuffing him in front of his neighbors as though he were a criminal. Monica could feel the weight of every word, her heart heavy with both empathy and frustration. She had heard stories like this countless times before, but today, it struck deeper. This wasn't just about Isaiah, it was about every person who had been treated like him. And it was about her. Halfway through Isaiah's testimony, the courtroom door creaked open. Monica's stomach tightened as she looked up. The young officer from earlier entered the room, his face pale and strained. He walked stiffly to the witness stand, and Monica's gaze followed him, her nerves on edge. The prosecutor addressed the court. "We would like to call Officer Mark Dugan to the stand." Mark Dugan. Monica hadn't even caught his name during their earlier encounter. Now, she watched him closely as he settled into the chair, his movements awkward and hesitant. She forced herself to remain professional, even as anger simmered beneath the surface. This was the man who had looked at her, not as a judge, but as a suspect. The prosecutor began questioning Dugan, asking him to explain his actions on the day of Isaiah's arrest. "I was patrolling the area," Mark began, his voice faltering. "I saw Bennett, and he looked out of place." Monica's grip on the gavel tightened. That phrase, "out of place," she had heard it too many times. It was a thinly veiled excuse, a code for, "he was black, and I didn't think he belonged there." The prosecutor pressed further, her tone sharp. "What exactly made Mr. Bennett look out of place, Officer Dugan?" Mark shifted uncomfortably. He was acting nervous, looking around a lot. It seemed like he was up to something. Monica felt anger bubbling up again. She had already reviewed the case file. Isaiah hadn't been acting suspiciously. He had been waiting for a rideshare. There was no crime, no threat, just a young black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The prosecutor wasn't letting up. "Did you find anything on Mr. Bennett that suggested he had committed a crime?" Mark hesitated, his face reddening. "No," he admitted quietly, "we didn't." A tense silence filled the courtroom. Monica glanced at the jury. Some jurors appeared visibly moved, their expressions solemn. Others seemed conflicted, wrestling with what they were hearing. But the truth was unmistakable. Isaiah Bennett had been arrested for no reason other than the color of his skin. As Mark's testimony continued, small inconsistencies began to emerge. With each pointed question from the prosecutor, his version of events unraveled further. Monica watched him carefully, noting the way his eyes flickered toward her, filled with discomfort and recognition. He knew who she was now. He knew what he had done, not just to Isaiah Bennett, but to her that morning. When the prosecutor finally concluded her questioning, Mark Dugan sat slumped in the witness chair, a shadow of the confident officer who had confronted Monica outside. She felt no pity for him. Instead, she felt the weight of the truth sinking into the room, pressing on everyone present. This wasn't just about Mark or Isaiah. It was about a system that had allowed this kind of bias to flourish unchecked for far too long. Monica took a deep breath, steadying herself as the trial moved forward. The path to justice was far from over, but she was determined to see it through. As the trial continued, Monica worked to keep her emotions in check. She reminded herself of her duty to remain impartial and ensure justice was served. But it wasn't easy. The parallels between her personal experience and Isaiah Bennett's case were glaring and impossible to ignore. By the end of the day, the courtroom buzzed with tension. The defense attorney delivered their closing statements, attempting to frame Mark Dugan as a well-meaning officer who had made an honest mistake. Monica listened with a neutral expression, but inside she bristled. She knew better, and so did the prosecutor, Anita Hayes. Anita rose for her final argument, her voice steady and resolute as she addressed the jury. "This case isn't just about Isaiah Bennett," she began, her words measured and deliberate. "It's about a pattern that we've seen repeated in our justice system time and time again. It's about officers like Mark Dugan who see a young black man in a neighborhood and automatically assume he's up to no good. This assumption doesn't just lead to wrongful arrests, it leads to humiliation, to injustice, and it has to stop." The courtroom was silent as Anita's words hung in the air. Monica could feel the shift in the room. The jury was listening. They were absorbing the gravity of what had been said. When the trial concluded for the day, Monica dismissed the court and watched as the room emptied. But she didn't move. She remained seated at the bench, her thoughts swirling. She had presided over the case fairly, as her role demanded, but she couldn't shake the sting of what had happened earlier that day. No matter how high she climbed in her career, no matter how much she achieved, she would always be seen through the lens of her race first. The realization was sobering, and it gnawed at her. The sound of the courtroom door creaking open interrupted her thoughts. Monica looked up to see Sergeant James Hayes, the older officer who had intervened outside earlier, approaching the bench. His face was etched with concern. "Judge Carter," he said softly, his tone respectful. "May I have a word?" Monica nodded, gesturing for him to step closer. "Of course, Sergeant." James sighed, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened earlier with Dugan," he began. "He's not a bad kid, you know, but he's got blind spots like a lot of them do." Monica's gaze didn't waver, her expression unreadable. "Blind spots," she repeated, her voice tinged with bitterness. "You mean racism?" James winced but didn't argue. "Maybe, probably," he admitted. "But I want you to know, I'm working to fix it, from the inside." Monica studied him, her sharp eyes searching for sincerity. She wanted to believe him, to believe that meaningful change was possible. But after everything she had witnessed, everything she had experienced, hope felt like a fragile thing. "What do you suggest I do?" she asked quietly. "When I sit here day after day, hearing cases like this, knowing I've lived through it firsthand." James was silent for a long moment before answering. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge," he said finally. "You keep holding people accountable. That's how change starts. It's slow, but it's the only way." Monica nodded slowly, though the weight of his words pressed heavily on her shoulders. The trial wasn't over yet, and there would be more battles to fight. But at least today, they had taken one step forward. As James left the room, Monica glanced around the now empty courtroom. She knew the fight for justice was far from over. But for the first time that day, she allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. Today, at least, the truth had been brought to light. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. The jury had been deliberating all night, and their decision was expected today. Monica sat in her chambers, attempting to center herself for what she knew would be a pivotal moment, not just for Isaiah Bennett, but for everyone who had been following this trial. This case was larger than one man's wrongful arrest. It had become a symbol, a rallying point for conversations about systemic bias and racial profiling. Monica knew that whatever verdict the jury reached, the fight wouldn't end here. Sipping her coffee, she glanced at the files spread across her desk. The weight of the case settled over her again, but she steeled herself. She had a duty to fulfill, and she wouldn't falter. When the knock finally came on her door, Monica took a deep breath and rose to her feet. "Come in," she said. Her clerk stepped inside, holding a folder. "The jury is ready, Judge." Monica nodded, smoothing her robe. "Let's do this." As she made her way to the courtroom, the echoes of her footsteps filled the hallway. Outside, the buzz of reporters and protesters was faint but constant, a reminder of the impact this trial was having beyond the courthouse walls. Monica pushed open the courtroom doors and took her place at the bench, ready to face whatever came next. The walk to the courtroom felt longer than usual. Monica's footsteps echoed down the hallway, each one reverberating with the weight of the moment. The tension wasn't confined to the courtroom today. It seemed to hang in the very air, pressing down on everyone inside the building. When Monica entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick and stifling. Reporters packed the gallery, their pens poised and cameras at the ready. In the front rows, the families of Isaiah Bennett and Officer Mark Dugan sat silently, their faces tight with anticipation. Monica settled into her seat at the bench, her gaze briefly landing on Isaiah. He sat beside his attorney, his expression somber but calm. There was a flicker of hope in his eyes, a hope that justice would prevail, that this trial might actually mean something. She shifted her gaze to Mark Dugan. He looked markedly different than he had earlier in the trial. His confidence was gone, replaced by nervous glances darting around the room. For the first time, he seemed small, a man fully aware that he couldn't escape accountability for his actions. Clearing her throat, Monica broke the silence. "Please bring in the jury," she instructed, her voice carrying through the room. The double doors opened, and the 12 jurors filed in, their faces unreadable as they took their seats. Monica watched them closely, searching for any hint of their decision, but their expressions betrayed nothing. The jury foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, stood. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a folded piece of paper, the weight of her role evident in every motion. Monica nodded toward her. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson unfolded the paper, her voice quivering as she began. "We have, Your Honor." "Please read the verdict," Monica instructed, her own heart pounding, though her face remained composed. The foreperson glanced at the paper before speaking, her voice growing steadier with each word. "In the case of Officer Mark Dugan, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination." A ripple of reaction swept through the courtroom. A murmur arose from the gallery, a mix of relief and tension. Monica's gaze flicked to Isaiah Bennett, who sat frozen in his seat, his face unreadable. Slowly the relief began to spread across his features, and he exhaled deeply. His lawyer patted him on the back as Isaiah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Monica then turned her attention to Mark Dugan. His face was pale, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of the verdict had physically crushed him. For a moment he simply stared ahead, his expression blank. Monica banged her gavel once, the sharp sound cutting through the noise. "Court is adjourned," she announced, but as people began to rise from their seats, Monica remained at the bench, her mind racing. This verdict was a step toward justice, but it wasn't the end. The fight against systemic bias was far from over. As she glanced around the room, taking in the mix of relief and lingering tension, she knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Tomorrow, the work would continue. But for today, a small piece of justice had been served. And that, Monica thought, was a start. But as Monica began to gather her thoughts, Mark suddenly stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking. Monica paused, looking down at him from the bench. The room quieted again as all eyes turned toward the young officer. He was visibly shaking, his face pale as he struggled to find his words. I need to say something," he began, swallowing hard as his gaze dropped to the floor. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the community, but I was wrong." His voice wavered, thick with emotion. "I see now that I let my assumptions, my prejudices cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry." The silence that followed was deafening. Monica felt her breath catch in her throat. It was an apology, yes, but it wasn't enough. It couldn't undo the harm that had already been done. She thought of all the time she had been in Isaiah Bennett's shoes, stopped for no reason other than being black. This apology, though sincere, wouldn't erase those experiences or the systemic issues that had allowed them to happen. Monica met Mark's eyes, her voice steady but firm. "Your apology is noted, Officer Dugan, But the harm caused by your actions, by actions like yours, runs deep. It affects lives, families, and entire communities. Mark nodded slowly, the defeat clear in his posture. He didn't argue or try to explain further. He simply stood there, accepting the consequences of his actions. For the first time, Monica saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. As the courtroom gradually emptied, Monica remained seated. She watched Isaiah Bennett embrace his family, his face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Across the room, Mark stood quietly by the exit, waiting to be escorted out. The weight of his guilt seemed to rest heavily on his shoulders. Monica's mind raced. She had done her job, upheld the law, and presided fairly over this case. Yet it didn't feel like enough. This trial was just one drop in a vast ocean of injustice. For every Isaiah Bennett who received a measure of justice, there were countless others whose stories would never be told, whose cases would never see a courtroom. The door to the courtroom creaked open, pulling Monica from her thoughts. She looked up to see Sergeant James Hayes, the older officer who had intervened during her confrontation with Mark outside the courthouse. He approached quietly, his face a mix of concern and perhaps a glimmer of hope. "Judge Carter," he said softly, stopping near the bench. "May I have a word?" Monica nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Of course." James took a seat, folding his hands in front of him. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I just wanted to say thank you." Monica raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For handling this case the way you did," James replied. "For holding us accountable. We need that. The system needs that." Monica let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair. "I appreciate that, Sergeant, but it doesn't feel like enough. This was just one case. There are so many more out there, so many people who don't get justice." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, but that's why we have to keep pushing. It's not going to change overnight, but every step matters. Every case like this chips away at the bigger problem." Monica was silent for a moment, turning his words over in her mind. She wanted to believe him, to believe that real change was possible. But after everything she had seen, it was hard to hold on to that hope. "What about Dugan?" she asked quietly. "What happens to officers like him, those who've been taught to think a certain way?" James sighed, his weariness showing. "I won't lie, it's hard. There are a lot of guys like him, but there are also people like me, trying to change things from the inside. And I'll keep doing that as long as I can." Monica studied him for a moment, seeing the determination in his eyes. It was the same determination she felt despite her own frustrations and setbacks. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge," James said firmly. "That's how we change this, piece by piece." Monica nodded slowly, his words echoing in her mind. "Piece by piece," she repeated. As James left the room, Monica sat back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the now empty courtroom. The fight wasn't over, it never would be. But today, a step had been taken. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Today, they had taken a step forward, but it was just one step in a long and arduous journey. Monica sighed, her gaze drifting across the now empty room. For Isaiah Bennett, this trial had been about proving his innocence, about reclaiming his dignity. But for Monica, it had come to symbolize something much larger. The issues that had brought Isaiah here weren't unique to him. They echoed through communities everywhere. As she stood to gather her files, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Judge Carter," Isaiah said, approaching her with his attorney at his side. Monica turned, surprised to see him lingering after the courtroom had cleared. His face was calm now, though the toll of the last few days was evident in the way he carried himself, his shoulders slightly slumped, his movements slow. "Yes, Isaiah," she said, her voice gentle. "I just wanted to say thank you," he began, his tone low but steady. Monica paused, considering his words before responding. "You don't need to thank me, Isaiah. I was just doing my job." Isaiah shook his head, his expression firm. "No, it's more than that. This trial, it wasn't just about me. It was about showing people what really happens out there, what we go through. You gave me a voice." Monica's chest tightened. She understood the weight of his words and the gratitude behind them. She nodded slowly. "I hope this is a step toward change," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But it's just one case. We still have a long way to go." Isaiah's eyes softened and he smiled faintly, a mix of understanding and hope on his face. "I know," he replied, "but it's a start. And for that, I'm grateful. Monica watched as Isaiah turned to leave, his attorney following close behind. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment. He was right. It was a start. But as much as today had marked a small victory, she couldn't shake the feeling of how much more work lay ahead. Gathering her belongings, Monica made her way to her chambers. Her footsteps were slow and deliberate, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She avoided the courthouse's main entrance, knowing it was swarmed with reporters and cameras. Instead, she opted for the side door, hoping for a quiet exit. As soon as she pushed open the door, Monica froze. Standing by the side of the building was Mark Dugan. He leaned against the wall, his uniform hanging loosely on his frame as though the weight of the trial had diminished him. His face was drawn and pale, his exhaustion visible in every line. Monica's heart thudded in her chest as she stopped in her tracks. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the air was heavy, a blend of guilt, anger, and something unspoken. "Judge Carter," Mark said finally, his voice hoarse. He straightened up, his eyes locking onto hers. I didn't expect to see you here." Monica didn't respond immediately. She waited, her expression unreadable, unsure of what he could possibly say that would change anything. "I've been thinking," Mark continued, his words slow and deliberate, each one seeming to carry a weight of its own. "About everything. About what happened in there. About what I did to you." He paused, his hands fidgeting at his sides, his discomfort clear. "I know saying sorry isn't enough. It won't fix what I did. But I need you to know. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Monica's eyes narrowed. She had heard variations of this apology countless times before. She let his words hang in the air before replying, her tone cold and measured. "You didn't mean for it to happen," she repeated. "But it did happen, Officer Dugan, and it keeps happening. To people like Isaiah, to people like me. So forgive me if I'm not moved by your remorse right now." Mark winced, but didn't look away. "I know I screwed up," he said quietly. "I know I let my biases take over. I'm trying to understand that now, but it's not as simple as just unlearning everything overnight." Monica crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "What changed now? The fact that you got caught? Or the fact that someone finally called you out on it?" Mark flinched again but held his ground. "Both," he admitted after a long pause. "But I want to do better. I need to do better. And I'm going to try." Monica studied him, searching for sincerity in his expression. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that change was possible. But after everything she had seen, after everything she had experienced, hope didn't come easily. "Trying isn't enough," she said finally, "but it's a start. Just like today was a start." Mark nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the ground. "Thank you, Judge Carter," he said softly before turning and walking away. Monica stood there for a moment, watching him leave. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But today she thought they had taken another small step forward, and sometimes that was all they could do. Monica remained silent for a moment, turning his words over in her mind. She wanted to believe him, to believe that change was possible. But the years of witnessing injustice and the burdens of her own experiences made it hard to hold on to that hope. "What happens to officers like him?" she asked quietly, shifting her attention to Sergeant James Hayes, who stood nearby. "What happens to the ones who've been taught to think this way their entire lives?" James sighed deeply, a weariness etched into his face. "I'm not going to lie, it's hard," he replied. "There are a lot of officers like him. But there are also people like me, trying to change things from the inside. It's not easy, but I'll keep doing it as long as I can." Monica studied him, recognizing the same determination in his eyes that she felt within herself. Despite the setbacks, despite the frustrations, it was that determination that kept them both moving forward. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge," James added firmly. "That's how we change this. Piece by piece." Monica nodded slowly, her voice steady but quiet as she echoed his words. "Piece by piece." When James left the room, Monica remained seated, staring at the empty courtroom. The fight wasn't over, it never would be. But today, they had taken one step forward, and as small as it might seem in the grand scheme of things, it was still a step. The echoes of the day's events still rang in Monica's mind as the courtroom emptied. The verdict had been delivered, and justice, in some form, had been served. But for Monica, the impact of the trial was just beginning. This wasn't a victory she could celebrate. The issues that had brought Isaiah Bennett into this courtroom weren't confined to him. They stretched into countless communities, shaping lives in ways that were both invisible and painfully clear. The fight for justice didn't end here. Monica stood, gathering her files, when a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Judge Carter," Isaiah said as he approached with his attorney. Monica turned to face him. His posture was more relaxed than it had been throughout the trial, but the exhaustion of the past few days was still visible in his eyes. "Yes, Isaiah," she said, her tone soft but curious. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an earnestness that made Monica pause. "You don't need to thank me," she replied after a moment. "I was just doing my job." Isaiah shook his head, his expression resolute. "No, it's more than that. This trial, it wasn't just about me. It was about showing people what really happens out there. What we go through. You gave me a voice." Monica's chest tightened as his words sank in. She nodded slowly, her voice measured. "I hope this is a step toward change," she said. "But it's just one case. We still have a long way to go." "I know," Isaiah said, a faint smile touching his lips, "but it's a start. And for that, I'm grateful." Monica watched as he walked away, his attorney following close behind. Even as relief settled into Isaiah's expression, Monica couldn't shake the feeling that so much work still lay ahead. One trial, one verdict. It wasn't enough to dismantle a system built on centuries of bias. But Isaiah was right. It was a start. Monica sighed as she left the courtroom, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The media had swarmed the courthouse's front entrance, their cameras and microphones ready to pounce. Hoping to avoid the chaos, she opted to leave through the side door. When she pushed the door open, however, she froze. Standing by the side of the building was Mark Dugan. He leaned against the wall, his face drawn and pale. His uniform hung loosely on his frame, as though the weight of the trial had physically diminished him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of guilt, anger, and confusion hanging in the air. "Judge Carter," Mark said finally, his voice hoarse. He straightened up, meeting her eyes hesitantly. I didn't expect to see you here." Monica remained silent, her expression unreadable as she waited for him to continue. "I've been thinking," Mark began, his words slow and deliberate, "about everything, about what happened in there, about what I did to you." He paused, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "I know saying sorry isn't enough. It won't fix what I did. But I need you to know, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Monica's gaze hardened. She had heard apologies like this before, and they always sounded the same. "You didn't mean for it to happen," she repeated, her tone icy. "But it did happen, Officer Dugan, and it keeps happening, to people like Isaiah, to people like me. So forgive me if I'm not moved by your remorse right now." Mark flinched but didn't look away. "I know I screwed up," he admitted quietly. "I let my biases take over. I'm trying to understand that now, but it's not as simple as just unlearning everything overnight." Monica crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. "And what are you going to do about it?" Mark hesitated, but his voice was firm when he answered. "I don't know yet, but I want to do better. I need to do better." Monica studied him for a long moment, searching for sincerity in his eyes. She wanted to believe him, to believe that people could change, but after everything she had seen, hope felt like a fragile thing. "Trying isn't enough," she said finally, "but it's a start." Mark nodded slowly, his expression subdued. "Thank you, Judge Carter," he said quietly before turning and walking away. Monica stood there for a moment, watching him disappear into the night. The fight wasn't over, not for her, not for Isaiah, and not for Mark. But today, another step had been taken. And sometimes that was all they could do. Monica watched him go, standing still in the cool air. The tension that had gripped her chest since stepping out of the courthouse eased slightly, but not completely. The fight wasn't over. Not for Mark, not for Isaiah, and certainly not for her. Piece by piece. That was how Sergeant Hayes had described it. The phrase echoed in her mind again, a reminder that while today's trial had brought some measure of justice, it was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. With a sigh, Monica turned and began walking to her car. The street was quiet now, the reporters and cameras gone, but she could still feel the weight of their attention lingering in the air. This trial had brought Isaiah a small sense of vindication. But Monica knew there were countless others whose stories would never make headlines, whose injustices would remain in the dark. As she opened her car door, Monica paused for a moment, looking back at the courthouse. The towering building was a symbol of the justice system, a system she had spent her career trying to navigate, challenge, and improve. The road ahead was long, and the obstacles were immense, but as she settled into the driver's seat and started the engine, Monica resolved herself once again to the fight. Piece by piece, she thought, that was how change began.